Welcome back once again to the Imaginary Gallery. This is TJ, your host. We're continuing down the road of the Psychopath bag of tricks, referencing a very important section of Robert D. Hare's book, Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. And you'll find many of these concepts translate on over to the other cluster B creatures. This section offers a unique insight, especially good for those of you like me who wonder what makes this creature tick. Psychology was my major, and I've dealt with many of these creatures, and this particular section I find very valuable. Dr. Hare asks us, who's in charge? And he talks about the two different sides of the brain, and how each one has a different specialized function. The left cerebral hemisphere is skilled at processing information in an analytical manner and a sequential manner, and plays a crucial role in understanding and the use of language. The right side of the brain processes information simultaneously. As a whole, it plays an important role in the perception of spatial relations, imagery, and the processing of music. Nature, he believes, probably arranged for each side of this brain to have these distinctively different functions for the sake of efficiency. For example, it's clearly more effective for all the complex mental operations required to use and to understand language to take place on one side of the brain than if they were distributed over both sides. In the latter case, both sides, information would have to be sent back and forth between the left and the right side of your brain, which would slow down the processing rate and may also increase the chances of error. Further, some part of the brain has to have a primary control over the task. If the two sides of someone's brains competing for this control, the conflict would reduce the efficiency of processing. And there we have dyslexia and stuttering, for example, as results of such a situation. Language centers are associated with such a condition. Competition between the language centers are bilateral, which means they're located in both left and right hemispheres. Competition between these two hemispheres makes for a variety of difficulties in the understanding and production of language. Experimental evidence suggests that bilateral language processes are also characteristic of psychopathy and other cluster B. This leads Dr. Hare, the author, to speculate that part of the tendency for psychopaths to make contradictory statements is related to an inefficient, quote, line of authority, which means each hemisphere tries to run the show, with the result that speech is poorly integrated and poorly monitored. Of course, others with bilateral language, like some stutterers, some dyslexic, and left-handers, do not lie and do not contradict themselves in the way that these creatures do. Clearly, something else must be involved. Next, he covers hollow words. And then he talks about me. He says most people who've had extensive experience with these types of creatures have an intuitive sense of what the difference might be. Quote,
he was always telling me how much he loved me, and at first I believed him, even after I caught him fooling around with my sister,
said the estranged wife of one of Dr. Hare's psychopathic subjects.
It took me a long time to realize he didn't care for me at all. Every time he'd beat up on me, he'd say,
I'm really sorry, Pigeon. You know I love you.
Right out of a cheap movie.
Now, this would come as no surprise to any clinician who are long aware that these psychopaths seem to know the dictionary meanings of words, but they fail to comprehend or to appreciate the emotional value or significance. Consider the following quotes from the clinical literature on psychopathy. He knows the words but not the music. Ideas of mutuality, of sharing and understanding are beyond his understanding in an emotional sense. He knows only the book meaning of words. He exhibits a facility with words that mean little to him, form without substance. His seemingly good judgment and social sense are only word deep. These clinical observations get right to the heart of the mystery of psychopathy, language that is two-dimensional and lacking in emotional depth. And then he gives us a nice analogy that really helps to put this into perspective if you don't get it. He says that the cluster B psychopathic creature is much like a colorblind person who, let's say, sees the entire world in shades of gray. But this person has also learned to function within a colored world. He's learned that the light signal for stop, for example, is at the top of the traffic signal. When the colorblind person tells you that he stopped at the red light, he really means that he stopped at the top light. He's got difficulty in discussing the color of things, but may have learned all sorts of ways to compensate for this particular problem. And in some cases, even those people who know him may not even know that he's not able to see color. Like the colorblind individual, the psychopath lacks an important element of experience. In this case, emotional experience. But he may have learned the words that others use to describe or mimic experiences that it can't really understand. As Cleckley put it,
he can learn to use ordinary words and will also learn to reproduce appropriately all the pantomimes of feeling, but the feeling itself is just not there. It does not come to pass.
Laboratory research provides convincing support for these clinical observations. This research is based on evidence that for regular non-cluster B creatures, neutral words generally convey less information than emotional words. So a word like paper has a dictionary meaning, whereas a word such as death has dictionary meaning plus emotional meaning and unpleasant connotations. Emotional words like death pack more of a punch than other words. Then Dr. Hare says for you to picture yourself sitting before a computer screen, letters flash upon your screen for a fraction of a second. Electrodes for reading brain responses have been attached to your scalp and connected to an EEG machine. And this machine draws a graph of the electrical activity in the brain. Some of these groups of letters flashed on the screen form common words, which would be found in a dictionary. Other strings of words form no words, only nonsense syllables. For example, T-R-E-E, tree, that forms a word, but R-E-T-E doesn't. Your task is to push a button as quickly as possible whenever you've decided that there's a true word appearing on the screen. The computer will measure the time it takes you to make this decision. It also analyzes your brain responses during this task. You'll probably respond much faster to an emotional word rather than a neutral word. For example, you and most others would push the button quickly at the word death than you would at the word paper. The emotional content of a word seems to give a sort of turbo boost to the decision-making process. At the same time, the emotional words evoke larger brain responses than those neutral words, a reflection of the relatively large amount of information that's contained in these emotional words. When Dr. Hare and his people used this laboratory task with prison inmates, the non-psychopath people showed the normal pattern of responses. Quicker decisions and larger brain responses to emotional rather than neutral words. But the psychopaths did not. They responded to emotional words as if they were the neutral words. This dramatic finding provided strong support for the argument that words do not have the same emotional or affective coloring for these cluster B creature psychopaths as they do for regular other people. Some of his more recent research provides additional support for this thesis, which confirms that, for whatever reason, psychopaths lack some of the feelable components of language. This deficiency has fascinating implications, especially when you consider this in the context of a psychopath's social interaction. Manipulative deceit uninhibited by empathy or conscience. For most of us, language has the capacity to elicit powerful emotional feelings. For example, the word cancer evokes not only a clinical description of a disease and its symptoms, but also a sense of fear, a sense of apprehension, or of concern, and maybe even disturbing mental images of what it might be like to have cancer. But to the psychopath, a word is just a word. In a book explaining her side of the shooting of her 3 kids, Diane Downs described her casual relationships with a score of men as loveless, motivated only by sex. In letters she sent to Robert Berta Lucini, a fellow letter carrier, she wrote of her promises of undying love, devotion, and oaths that nobody else on earth would ever touch her. It was the game that she played with the men. She played it best with this guy, which she refers to as Bert. After shooting her kids, she had an affair with Jason Redding and wrote,
"But Bert was in the past, and Jason was in the present. True, I was writing letters to Bert telling him how much I loved him, that he was the only man on earth for me."
When he began to refuse the letters, she started saving them in a notebook, making an entry each night. Most would be a paragraph or two, sometimes even a page. The entries were the same, just different wording.
"I love you, Bert. Why aren't you here? I need you. You're the only man for me."
She says that she mixed a drink and wrote her hollow words of love to Bert and then sank into a hot bubble bath. She thought about Bert. Minutes later, Jason knocked at the door. She flew down the stairs to meet him, and her thoughts of Bert just disappeared. Now, in this case, this lady Diane's hollow words of love were a source of pride to her, as if their use was entirely intentional, designed for a particular purpose. However, like all psychopaths, her words of love could not be anything but hollow, because she lacks the capacity to impart real feeling in these words. Previously, Dr. Hare discussed the role of inner speech in the development and operation of conscience. It's the emotionally charged thoughts, images, and internal dialogue that give the bite to conscience, account for its powerful control over behavior, and generates guilt and remorse for transgressions. This is something that these cluster B psychopath creatures cannot understand. For them, conscience is little more than an intellectual awareness of rules others make up, empty words. The feelings needed to give clout to these rules are missing. Dr. Hare states that the question is, why?
I am the devil. What? I mean, I am the narcopath. The one that you'll never forget. The one who stole your heart. I'm here to give you a few more confessions. So maybe your life will be a little smoother once you know what was going on behind the scenes.
I know it bothers you. I seem to be so close to you. It was like we were soulmates, like we were born to be together. And I know it really shocked you. After everything seemed fine one day, I just told you that we had to end it. Oh, not because of anyone else, I said, which you soon found out that was a lie. Clearly, what happened was I found a better source of supply. You were getting inconvenient because you started to snoop. You started finding out things you weren't supposed to find out, and I figured my chances are better off with this new one. But I couldn't tell you, so I tried to convince you that I just sat at home alone every night. I tried to convince you that I was hanging out with my family and trying to get things back together so I know what I want to be as a person. But all the while I was hot to trot with this new guy who had no clue about me. See? The less they know about me, the better off I do. So when I've spent enough time with you and you've figured out enough stuff about me, it gets to the point where I can't hide it anymore. That's when I start to look for someone new. But I would never tell you this because the new one might not work out. I can't have that because if I tell you I'm working on a new one and the new one fizzles out, then that leaves me with nothing. And honey, that ain't gonna happen. I usually have at least 1 to 2 at a time, at the same time. Sometimes I search for a third and a fourth. You got to see how close I appeared to be to you, and then how I just dropped you like a hot, rotten potato. And of course, I remember you saying, oh, you must have found someone else. Oh, it must be that cute guy at the swimming pool with the little tiny bikini panties on with a huge bulge. And of course, I told you I didn't even notice him, even though turned out that was the one. Again, I couldn't tell you any of this. That would ruin my game. I just tell you that you're wrong. If you happen to see me with that boy from the swimming pool, I would just tell you, oh, well, he wasn't the one I left you for. I was alone, and there was some other person named Charles I was with, which I completely would make up. Because you were right. You knew that was after the guy with the bulge. Who wouldn't be? I couldn't tell you that because that would give you power to know that you know what I'm up to, and I can't have that. So notice, you were spot on many occasions. Our discussion. Every time I told you,
Oh no, that's not the way it is.
sorry, no.
No, that's not why I did that. Oh no,
I wasn't even looking at him. You've got problems, and that let me get through. So now that I'm giving the confession, yes, kiss yourself in the face, you were right. Yes, I wanted the boy at the pool. Big deal. So what? He's history now anyway.
on to his brother now.
And then the evening comes with my so much alive ahead. We'll find a place with room to grow. Caring for myself that I'm new to us. Watching the signs along the way. Don't pick me up, just the two of us. We're getting together today. Together. And when the evening comes with my so much life ahead, we'll find a place with room to grow. And yes, we've just begun.